The makeshift platform creaked under Isabella Crawford's trembling legs as 7 pairs of hungry eyes devoured her from below. Dust swirled through Copper Ridge's main street, carrying the stench of unwashed bodies and broken dreams. The setting sun cast long shadows across the crowd, painting everything in shades of blood and desperation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Gentlemen, we have ourselves a rare opportunity, bellowed Marcus Thornfield, the town's self-appointed auctioneer. His voice boomed across the assembled men like a carnival barker hawking his wares. Fresh from the convent, untouched by the corruption of this world, Sister Mary Catherine has vouched for her purity. Isabella's stomach churned at the word. The black habit she wore felt like a shroud, marking her as different as prey. She kept her eyes fixed on the distant mountains, their peaks reaching toward heaven while she stood trapped in this earthly hell. 3 days ago, she had been kneading bread in the convent kitchen, her hands covered in flour, her mind occupied with prayers and simple tasks. The sisters had raised her since she was 7 years old, teaching her to read Latin, to heal the sick with herbs, to find God in the quiet moments between dawn and sunrise. Now Sister Agnes lay cold in the ground, and Isabella stood alone. A world that saw her as nothing more than a commodity to be traded. The bidding starts at $50, Thornfield announced, his grin revealing teeth stained brown with tobacco. Remember, gentlemen, this ain't your typical saloon girl. Here's a genuine article. The crowd pressed closer, a writhing mass of desperate men who had crawled out of saloons, mining camps and cattle ranches. Their faces told stories of loneliness and hunger that went far beyond food. These were men who had forgotten what it meant to be gentle, who had spent so long in the company of animals and other broken souls that they had lost touch with basic humanity. 60, shouted Jeremiah Blackwood, a cattle baron whose reputation for cruelty extended far beyond his treatment of livestock. His massive frame dominated the front of the crowd, and his scarred hands had sent more than one man to an early grave. Isabella had heard whispers about his previous wives, women who had disappeared into his sprawling ranch never to be seen again. 75. The voice belonged to Dutch Morrison, a mining foreman whose silver operation had made him wealthy but not respectable. His pale eyes held the glint of a man who had spent too many years underground, emerging only to prey on those weaker than himself. The miners who worked on his claims told stories of accidents that weren't accidents, of men who asked too many questions about working conditions and subsequently found themselves trapped in cave-ins. Isabella's breath came in short gasps. The rope binding her wrists had been tied just tight enough to remind her of her helplessness without leaving visible marks. Thornfield understood the importance of presentation. A bruised product fetched lower prices, and he intended to maximize his investment. The story of how she had arrived at this moment played through her mind like a fever dream. 3 weeks ago, pneumonia had swept through the convent like wildfire. Sister Agnes, the elderly nun who had served as Isabella's guardian and protector, had succumbed first. One by one, the other sisters had followed until only Isabella remained. Among the living, she had tended to them all, brewing willow bark tea to ease their fevers, holding their hands as they passed into whatever waited beyond this world. When the last sister drew her final breath, Isabella had found herself alone in a building that suddenly felt vast and empty as a cathedral built for giants. That was when Thornfield had arrived with his papers and his practiced smile. He claimed that the convent owed substantial debts to various creditors in town. The sisters, he explained with mock sympathy, had been borrowing money for years to keep the orphanage running. Medical supplies, food, building repairs, it all added up to a sum that made Isabella's head spin. "Now don't you worry, child," Thornfield had said, his voice dripping with false kindness. I found a solution that benefits everyone. These men need companionship and you need protection. It's a practical arrangement. The legal papers he showed her might as well have been written in hieroglyphics. Isabella could read Latin fluently, could recite vast passages of scripture from memory, but the language of contracts and debts remained as foreign to her as the surface of the moon. Thornfield had explained that 7 prominent citizens of Copper Ridge had agreed to share the cost of purchasing her debt. In return, she would provide them with companionship and domestic services. The word services had hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. $100. The bid came from Samuel Garrett, a railroad man whose construction crews had carved a path through the mountains at the cost of countless Chinese workers' lives. His reputation for ruthlessness had made him wealthy, but it had also made him enemies. He traveled with bodyguards and slept with loaded weapons beside his bed, knowing that someday his past would catch up with him. $125. This from Thomas Crane, who owned the largest lumber operation in 3 counties. His sawmill workers lived in constant fear of losing fingers, hands, or worse, to the massive blades that never seemed to stop turning. Crane himself had lost his left arm to his own machinery years ago, but rather than developing sympathy for his workers, the experience had only made him more demanding and less forgiving of human frailty. The bidding continued to climb, each new amount feeling like another nail in Isabella's coffin. She closed her eyes and tried to transport herself back to the convent garden, where she had spent countless hours tending vegetables and flowers. The sisters had taught her that God could be found in growing things, in the miracle of seeds becoming sustenance. Now that the garden lay abandoned, weeds are already beginning to reclaim the carefully tended rows. $150. The voice belonged to Edgar Vance, a land speculator who had made his fortune buying property from desperate families and reselling it to railroad companies. His business practices had left dozens of families homeless, but he justified his actions by claiming he was simply helping people realize the value of their assets. His wife had died under mysterious circumstances the previous winter, and tongues wagged about whether her fall down the stairs had been as accidental as he claimed. $175. Maxwell Sterling, the owner of 3 different gambling establishments, entered the bidding with characteristic confidence. His saloons and card rooms operated on the principle that hope was the most valuable commodity in a frontier town. Men would gamble away their wages, their property, even their futures, clinging to the belief that the next hand would change everything. Sterling understood that desperation was more profitable than gold. Isabella felt tears threatening to spill down her cheeks, but she forced them back. The sisters had taught her that tears were a luxury that could attract the wrong kind of attention. In this crowd of predators, any sign of weakness would only increase their appetite for what they saw as their prize. The 7th man had not yet entered the bidding, but Isabella could feel his presence like a cold wind. Calvin Murdoch stood at the edge of the crowd, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Unlike the others, who at least pretended to see her as a woman, Murdoch looked at her like she was a specimen in a jar, something to be studied and dissected. He owned the town's only doctor's office, but the treatments he provided often left patients worse off than when they arrived. There were whispers about experiments conducted in his basement, about patients who checked in with minor ailments and were never seen again. $200. Blackwood's voice cut through her reverie like a whip crack. The cattle baron's bid had silenced the crowd, and even Thornfield looked impressed by the amount. $200 represented more money than most men in Copper Ridge would see in 5 years of honest work. Going once, Thornfield called out, his gavel raised like an executioner's axe. $200 for this fine specimen of Christian womanhood. Isabella's legs nearly gave out beneath her. In moments, she would belong to Jeremiah Blackwood, a man whose previous wives had learned too late that his appetites extended far beyond the normal desires of marriage. She would disappear into his ranch like smoke into wind, and no one would ask questions about what happened behind his gates. Going twice! The gavel began its descent toward the wooden block that would seal her fate. That was when she heard the voice that would change everything. $500. The words came from the back of the crowd, spoken quietly, but with such authority that every head turned. Isabella craned her neck to see past the assembled men, searching for the source of salvation, or perhaps just another form of damnation. The crowd parted reluctantly, like water dividing around the prow of a ship. Through the gap stepped a figure that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. He was tall but gaunt, his frame suggesting strength that illness or injury had slowly carved away. His clothes, while clean, hung loose on his body as if tailored for a larger man. Most striking were his eyes, pale blue like winter sky, but holding depths that spoke of things seen and endured, that no man should have to witness. A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd as recognition dawned. This was Daniel McKinnon, the legendary gunfighter whose name had once been spoken in the same breath as Wild Bill Hickok and Doc Holliday. But that had been years ago, before whatever had befallen him in the mountains, before he had disappeared from the world of reputation and violence. Now he stood before them like a ghost made flesh, one hand resting lightly on the worn grip of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. The weapon looked ancient but well maintained, its steel worn smooth by decades of use. More importantly, everyone present understood that despite his apparent frailty, McKinnon could still draw and fire that weapon faster than most men could blink. "Did you say 500? Thornfield's voice cracked slightly as he spoke. Even a man of his limited morals understood that certain lines should not be crossed, and interfering with Daniel McKinnon's intentions had historically proven fatal. To those foolish enough to attempt it, McKinnon nodded once, a slight movement that somehow conveyed more authority than all of Thornfield's bluster and showmanship. "I did." Blackwood's face had turned purple with rage. "You can't just waltz in here and can't I?" McKinnon's voice remained soft, conversational even, but something in his tone made Blackwood's protest die in his throat. "Seems like an auction. To me, highest bidder wins. Unless you got more than $500 burning a hole in your pocket, Jeremiah." The use of Blackwood's first name sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. It suggested familiarity, history, perhaps old scores, waiting to be settled. Blackwood was a dangerous man in his own right, but even he understood the mathematics of a gunfight with Daniel McKinnon. The smart money said he would be dead before his weapon cleared leather. "This is irregular," Thornfield protested weakly. "The arrangement was specifically for these 7 gentlemen to share. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Arrangements change. McKinnon's pale eyes fixed on the auctioneer with the intensity of a hawk studying a rabbit. "Unless you're saying my money ain't good enough for your establishment." Thornfield's hands shook as he raised his gavel. He understood that he was caught between multiple dangerous men, any one of whom could end his life on a whim. But McKinnon's reputation cast the longest shadow, and dead auctioneers collected no commissions. "Going once at $500. He called out, his voice barely audible above the wind that had picked up, swirling dust devils through the crowd. Isabella stared at her unlikely savior, trying to understand what manner of man would spend such a fortune on a stranger. McKinnon's clothes suggested he was not wealthy. His boots were worn thin. His hat had seen better decades, and his coat bore the patches and repairs of a man who made do with what he had. Yet he had produced $500 in gold coin, as if it were pocket change, going twice. Thornfield's second call seemed to echo forever in the sudden silence. None of the 7 original bidders spoke. They understood the implicit threat in McKinnon's presence, the promise that challenging his bid would lead to consequences far more permanent than financial loss. In a frontier town where violence was common as dirt, certain men commanded respect. Through reputation alone, the gavel fell with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Sold to Daniel McKinnon for $500. Isabella felt her knees buckle with relief, though she understood that her situation had merely changed rather than improved. She knew nothing about this man beyond his fearsome reputation, nothing about his intentions or character. She had simply traded one unknown fate for another. McKinnon approached the platform with measured steps, each movement economical and purposeful. Up close, Isabella could see the signs of whatever illness was consuming him from within. His skin held the pallor of a man who had recently made peace with mortality, and a slight tremor in his left hand suggested pain that he was working hard to conceal. "Ma'am," he said simply, offering his arm to help her down from the platform. His touch was gentle, respectful, completely unlike the hungry gazes that had been devouring her moments before. As Isabella stepped down onto solid ground, she caught sight of something that made her breath catch in her throat. Tucked partially beneath McKinnon's vest was a telegram, its yellow paper bearing the distinctive markings of urgent communication. Though she could not read the contents, she could make out enough to see that it had been sent from Denver and marked with the highest priority designation. Whatever had brought Daniel McKinnon to Copper Ridge on this particular day, whatever had compelled him to spend his apparent life savings on a complete stranger, it was connected to that telegram. And somehow, Isabella understood that her rescue was not a random chance, but part of a larger story that was only beginning to unfold. The crowd began to disperse, grumbling about missed opportunities and unfair advantages. The 7 original bidders cast dark looks in McKinnon's direction, but none were foolish enough to voice their displeasure within earshot. They would remember this humiliation, would plot their revenge in the safety of their homes and businesses, but for now they retreated like wolves before a bigger predator. Thornfield collected his commission with shaking hands, counting out McKinnon's payment twice before stuffing the coins into his vest pocket. "Pleasure doing business with you," he said. Though his tone suggested anything but pleasure, McKinnon ignored him completely, his attention focused entirely on Isabella. "You got somewhere to go, miss? Family? Friends?" Isabella shook her head, not trusting her voice to remain steady. The convent had been her entire world, and that world had crumbled to dust in the span of 3 weeks. "Then I reckon we best figure something out," McKinnon said, his tone matter-of-fact despite the complexity of the situation he had just created. "Can't leave you standing in the street." As they walked away from the platform, Isabella found herself studying her mysterious benefactor from the corner of her eye. Despite his obvious illness, he moved with the fluid grace of a man who had spent his life ready for violence. His hand never strayed far from his weapon, and his eyes constantly scanned their surroundings for potential threats. But there was something else, something that set him apart from the predators she had just escaped. When he looked at her, she saw no hunger, no calculation of what she might provide him. Instead, she saw something that had been absent from her life for far too long: genuine, human kindness. The telegram crinkled softly in his vest as they walked, a paper reminder that this day had been set in motion by forces beyond either of their control. Isabella had been saved, but from what and for what purpose remained mysteries that would need unraveling. Behind them, Copper Ridge settled into its evening routine of drinking, gambling, and other diversions that helped frontier folk forget the harshness of their existence. But the 7 men who had been denied their prize would not forget, and in the growing darkness, new plans were already taking shape. The rescue had been accomplished, but the real story was just beginning. The wagon of Daniel McKinnon led her to surprise Isabella with its quality. Unlike the rickety contraptions most drifters used, this one bore the craftsmanship of skilled hands. The wood gleamed with careful maintenance, and the leather seats showed wear from use rather than neglect. 2 horses waited patiently in there, Traces, not the broken-down nags she expected, but strong animals with intelligent eyes and well-groomed coats. "Climb up," McKinnon said, offering his hand once more. His grip remained steady despite the tremor she had noticed earlier, and he helped her onto the bench seat with the practiced ease of a gentleman. As he settled beside her and gathered the reins, Isabella caught another glimpse of that mysterious telegram. The paper looked recent, its edges still crisp despite being folded and handled. Whatever news it contained had traveled far to reach him, and its urgency suggested matters of life and death. "Where are we going?" she asked, finding her voice. At last, the question had been burning in her throat since he had claimed her with his impossible bid. "My place. Ain't much, but it's got walls and a roof." McKinnon clicked his tongue, and the horses began moving with the smooth gait of animals that knew their business. "Figure you need somewhere safe to catch your breath and decide what comes next." Isabella studied his profile as they rolled through Copper Ridge's dusty streets. The late afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp angles that illness had carved from what had once been a fuller visage. She guessed he might have been handsome in his younger days, before whatever had hollowed out his cheeks and put that persistent cough in his chest. "Why did you help me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, born from a lifetime of being taught that everything came with a price. McKinnon's hands tightened almost imperceptibly on the reins. Sometimes a man sees something that ain't right and has to act. Simple as that. But Isabella sensed it wasn't simple at all. $500 represented a fortune to most people, enough to live comfortably for years in a place like Copper Ridge. No one spent that kind of money on impulse, especially not a man whose clothes suggested he counted every penny. They passed through the commercial district, where businesses were beginning to light their evening lamps. Isabella noticed how conversations stopped when people recognized McKinnon. Some folks tipped their hats respectfully. Others crossed the street to avoid his path entirely. His reputation preceded him like the bow wave of a ship, parting the waters of ordinary life. "You're not from here," she observed, noticing how he drove like a man unfamiliar with the local streets. "Rode this morning," he confirmed. "Got business that brought me through." The telegram crinkled again as he shifted position, and Isabella caught a glimpse of official-looking seals along its edge. Government correspondence, she realized, the kind that followed men who had served in wars or worked for territorial authorities. McKinnon's past was written in scars she couldn't see in documents he kept close to his chest. They left the town proper behind, following a well-worn trail that wound between stands of pine and aspen. The higher elevation brought cooler air and the promise of an early autumn. Isabella pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, grateful for even its modest warmth. "Tell me about yourself," McKinnon said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rhythm of hoofbeats and creaking. "Leather. How'd you end up in a convent?" The question opened doors Isabella had kept carefully locked. "My parents died when I was 7. Cholera outbreak that swept through their camp. The sisters found me 3 days later, half dead from thirst and hunger." She paused, remembering those early days of confusion and grief. "Sister Agnes said God had plans for me, that surviving when so many others didn't mean I had a purpose to fulfill." "And what did you think your purpose was?" Isabella considered the question carefully. "I thought it was to serve others. To heal the sick, teach children to read, help the sisters maintain their work. Simple things, but meaningful." McKinnon nodded slowly. Sometimes the simple things matter most. World's got plenty of folks looking to complicate everything, not near enough. Trying to make things better one small piece at a time. His words carried the weight of experience, of lessons learned in harder schools than any convent could provide. Isabella found herself relaxing slightly, sensing that whatever dangers this man might represent, immediate harm wasn't among them. Trail began climbing more steeply, winding through stands of timber that blocked their view of the surrounding countryside. McKinnon's horses took the grade without complaint, their steady breathing creating small clouds in the cooling air. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled against the darkening sky. "What about you?" Isabella asked, emboldened by his earlier questions. "What brings a man like you to a place like Copper Ridge?" McKinnon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Unfinished business, the kind that's been waiting too long to get settled." The telegram rustled again as he adjusted his position, and Isabella caught another glimpse of its contents. This time, she could make out a few words: location confirmed and urgent action required. Whatever had brought him here involved more than casual travel. "Are you a lawman?" she asked, remembering stories she had heard about federal marshals and territorial investigators. "Was once upon a time. These days I'm just a man trying to make things right before his time runs out." The admission hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Isabella understood now why he had spent so freely, why he moved with the careful economy of someone conserving limited strength. Daniel McKinnon was dying, and he knew it. "How long do you have?" The question came out more gently than she had intended, carrying the compassion the sisters had taught her to extend to all suffering souls. "Doc in Denver gave me 6 months. That was 4 months ago." McKinnon's voice held no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of a man who had made peace with mortality. "Figure I got maybe 8 weeks if I'm lucky, less if I push too hard." The revelation explained so much: his gaunt appearance, the careful way he moved, the tremor in his hands that spoke of pain barely held in check. Whatever illness was consuming him from within, it was winning the war despite his obvious efforts to fight it. "Then why spend your money on me?" Isabella asked. "Why not use it for medicine, doctors, treatments that might help?" McKinnon guided the horses around a sharp bend, revealing a small cabin nestled among the trees ahead. "Money can't buy what I need most, and what I need most is to know I left something good behind when I go." The cabin surprised Isabella with its solidity and care. Unlike the rough shacks most frontier dwellers called home, this structure had been built by someone who understood both craftsmanship and permanence. The logs fit together with precision. The roof showed no signs of leakage, and smoke rising from the chimney suggested a well-maintained fireplace within. "You built this?" she asked as McKinnon helped her down from the wagon. "Rented it from a widow who moved back east. She needed the money. I needed somewhere quiet too." He paused, searching for the right words. "To put my affairs in order." As they approached the front door, Isabella noticed details that spoke to McKinnon's character. The woodpile was neatly stacked and covered against weather. A small garden showed signs of recent tending, with late-season vegetables growing in orderly rows. Everything reflected the habits of a man who took care of his responsibilities regardless of personal circumstances. The interior proved even more impressive than the exterior. Clean rooms with solid furniture, windows that let in the fading daylight, and a kitchen equipped with everything necessary for comfortable living. Most importantly, Isabella noticed multiple exits and defensive positions, the instinctive arrangements of a man who had lived with danger for so long it had become second nature. "You can have the back bedroom," McKinnon said, hanging his hat on a peg near the door. "Door's got a good lock, windows face the forest instead of the trail. You'll have privacy and safety both." Isabella examined the room he indicated and found it better appointed than her cell at the convent had been. A comfortable bed with clean linens, a washstand with fresh water, even a small mirror and brush laid out on the dresser. Someone had prepared for her arrival, though that seemed impossible given the circumstances. "How did you know to get ready?" "For a guest?" she asked, returning to the main room where McKinnon was building up the fire. "Didn't know for certain," he admitted, adding kindling to the growing flames. "But when I heard about what was happening in town, figured I might need to take action. Always been a man who likes to be prepared." The fire caught and began throwing warm light around the room, creating shadows that danced across the log walls. Isabella noticed a rifle mounted above the mantelpiece and another weapon cabinet in the corner, both obviously well-maintained, but positioned for quick access rather than display. "Are you expecting trouble?" she asked, nodding toward the armaments. McKinnon's expression grew serious. "Those 7 men you met today aren't the type to accept disappointment gracefully. They paid good money expecting a certain outcome, and they're not going to be happy about getting outbid." The reality of her situation began settling over Isabella like a cold blanket. Her rescue had been real, but it had also created new enemies among men who already held positions of power in Copper Ridge. Blackwood, Sterling Crane, and the others weren't the type to simply walk away from what they saw as their rightful property. "What will they do?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. "Depends on how smart they are versus how angry," McKinnon replied, testing the coffee pot that had been warming near the fire. "Smart men would cut their losses and find entertainment elsewhere. Angry men might try to take by force what they couldn't buy legally." He poured 2 cups of coffee and offered one to Isabella. The liquid was strong and bitter, nothing like the herbal teas the sisters had favored, but it warmed her from the inside and helped clear her head. "And which do you think they are?" she asked. "Men like that don't get where they are by being smart," McKinnon said grimly. "They get there by taking what they want and crushing anyone who stands in their way. Tonight they're probably drinking and working themselves up to do something stupid." As if summoned by his words, the sound of distant hoofbeats began echoing through the forest. Multiple riders moving at speed, heading in their general direction. McKinnon set down his coffee cup and moved to the window, peering through a gap in the curtains at the darkening trail below. "How many?" Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. 6, maybe 7. Hard to tell in this light, but it's more than a social visit." McKinnon moved away from the window and began checking his weapons with the efficient motions of a man who had performed this ritual countless times before. "What do we do?" "We give them a chance to be smart about this," McKinnon said, loading cartridges into his rifle with steady hands despite the tremor that afflicted him at rest. "Sometimes showing strength prevents a fight better than hiding weakness invites." 1. The riders were closer now, their voices beginning to carry through the trees. Isabella could make out Blackwood's harsh laughter and Sterling's cultured tones, both men obviously fortified by liquid courage from their evening's drinking. The other voices blended together into an ugly chorus of entitlement and rage. McKinnon positioned himself near the front door, rifle held casually but ready for instant use. "Stay in your room," he told Isabella. "Whatever happens next, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "But what if—" "No what-ifs," McKinnon interrupted firmly. "I've been handling men like this since before you learned to walk. Trust me to know my business." Isabella retreated to the back bedroom, but left the door slightly ajar so she could hear what transpired. Through the gap, she watched McKinnon take a position where he could control the main room while maintaining clear fields of fire toward both the front door and windows. The hoofbeats stopped outside the cabin, followed by the creak of leather and jingle of spurs as men dismounted. Voices carried clearly through the thin walls, thick with alcohol and barely contained violence. "We know you're in there, McKinnon." Blackwood's voice boomed across the clearing. "We come to discuss a business matter." "Then you can discuss it from where you stand," McKinnon called back, his voice carrying easily through the closed door. "I'm listening." "You interfered with a legal transaction today," Sterling added, his words more measured but no less threatening. "Cost us considerable money and embarrassment." "Auction was open to all bidders," McKinnon replied calmly. "Nothing illegal about making the highest bid." "Maybe not," came another voice, Dutch Morrison. Isabella realized. "But there's nothing legal about keeping stolen property either. The girl belongs to us by right," Blackwood declared. "We had an arrangement, a contract. Your bid don't mean nothing." McKinnon's laugh held no humor whatsoever. Contract with who? Last I checked, nobody owns that young lady but herself. She owes debts. This from Thomas Crane, his voice sharp with frustration. Legal debts that give us a claim to her services. Debts that conveniently appeared after everyone who might dispute them are dead, McKinnon observed. Funny how that works out, ain't it? They were positioning themselves for assault, probably surrounding the cabin to prevent escape. McKinnon tracked their movements through sound alone, his rifle shifting to cover new angles as needed. Last chance, McKinnon, Blackwood called out. Send the girl out peaceable, and we'll let you ride away. Keep her, and we'll take her anyway after we put you in the ground. Here's my counteroffer, McKinnon replied, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper that somehow carried clearly through the walls. Mount up and ride back to town while you still can. Touch this door, and some of you won't be going home tonight. Silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Isabella held her breath, waiting for violence to explode across the peaceful evening. She could hear men shifting position, metal clicking against metal as weapons were readied for use. Then Edgar Vance's voice cut through the tension, carrying the careful tone of a man trying to prevent bloodshed. McKinnon's just one man, boys. But he's killed more folks than the rest of us combined. Maybe we should think this through. You getting yellow, Vance? Blackwood snarled. It's 7 against 1. 7 against Daniel McKinnon, Vance corrected. That's not the odds I like. The name carried weight even among men drunk on alcohol and anger. Isabella could hear uncertainty creeping into their voices, the mathematics of gunfighting overriding. The heat of wounded pride. McKinnon's reputation was earning them precious time to reconsider their position. But time, Isabella realized, was the one thing her protector couldn't afford to spend freely. Each moment of confrontation cost him strength he could barely spare, and the tremor in his hands seemed to be getting worse. As stress took its toll on his failing body, the standoff continued, balanced on the edge of violence while darkness settled over the forest like a burial shroud. The tension shattered like glass, hitting stone when Calvin Murdoch's voice sliced through the darkness. Unlike the others, his words carried no bluster or alcohol-fueled bravado, just the cold calculation of a man who had dissected human weakness, both literally and figuratively. Gentlemen, we're approaching this incorrectly, he said, his tone as clinical as if he were discussing surgical procedures. Mr. McKinnon is indeed formidable, but even legends have limitations. I suggest we consider his current condition. Isabella felt ice form in her stomach. Through the crack in her door, she watched McKinnon's shoulders tense. Somehow, the doctor had discovered his secret, the terminal illness that was slowly consuming him from within. What are you getting at, Doc? Blackwood demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Our friend McKinnon has been visiting physicians throughout the territory. Murdoch continued with the patience of a teacher instructing slow students. Denver, Colorado Springs even sent samples to specialists back east. The prognosis is unfavorable. McKinnon's grip tightened on his rifle, but he said nothing. Isabella could see the cost of maintaining his defensive posture. The slight tremor in his left hand had worsened, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the evening's coolness. Cancer of the stomach, Murdoch announced with professional detachment. Advanced stage, metastasized to other organs. I'd estimate 6 to 8 weeks remaining, possibly less given the stress of current circumstances. The pronouncement hung in the air like a death sentence, which Isabella realized it literally was. McKinnon's medical condition had become a weapon his enemies could wield against him, turning his failing body into their ally. So we wait, Sterling said, understanding dawning in his voice. Let time do our work for us. Or we expedite the process, Murdoch suggested. Stress, physical exertion, sustained conflict, any of these could accelerate his decline significantly. We need only create the proper conditions. Isabella watched McKinnon's face in profile and saw something that made her heart clench. For the first time since their meeting, he looked uncertain. Not afraid, she sensed that fear had been burned out of him years ago, but calculating odds that no longer favored his survival. "There's another factor to consider," came a new voice. From outside. Isabella didn't recognize the speaker, but his tone carried authority that made even Blackwood listen respectfully. "Sheriff Hartwell," McKinnon called out, a note of grim satisfaction entering his voice. "Wondered when you'd show up to earn your pay." The presence of local law enforcement should have been reassuring, but Isabella understood from McKinnon's tone that Sheriff Hartwell was not riding to their rescue. Corruption had deep roots in frontier towns, and men like Blackwood and Sterling had money enough to purchase official cooperation. "Daniel McKinnon," Hartwell said formally, "you're under arrest for interfering with a lawful business transaction and harboring stolen property." "What stolen property would that be, Sheriff?" McKinnon asked, though they all knew the answer. "The woman you took unlawfully from today's proceedings. She belongs to these gentlemen by right of legal contract and debt assumption." Isabella's hands clenched into fists. Even with a lawman present, she remained property to be traded rather than a person with rights of her own. The civilization these men claimed to represent was nothing more than organized barbarism dressed in legal language. "Produce the contract," McKinnon challenged. "Let me see this legal document that gives anyone ownership of a human being." "Contracts are on file at the courthouse," Hartwell replied smoothly. "All properly notarized and witnessed. Your business is with the courts now, not with me." "Funny thing about courthouse fires," McKinnon observed. "Amazing how they can destroy evidence that never existed in the first place." The implication struck home. Isabella realized that any documentation supporting the 7 men's claims would be fabricated after the fact, created by corrupt officials to justify actions already taken. Justice was for sale in Copper Ridge, and these men had deep enough pockets to buy whatever verdict they required. "Step outside with your hands visible," Hartwell ordered. "Submit to arrest peacefully, and no harm will come to you or the woman." McKinson's laugh was bitter as the winter wind. "Sheriff, I've been dealing with corrupt lawmen since before you learned to pin on a badge. I know exactly what kind of harm awaits anyone who trusts your word." Movement outside the cabin suggested men taking new positions. Isabella counted at least 8 distinct voices now, plus however many deputies Hartwell had brought with him. The odds, already unfavorable, had become impossible. "Daniel," she called softly from her doorway, "maybe we should stay where you are," he interrupted firmly, "and stay quiet. This ain't over yet." But Isabella could see it was over, or would be soon. McKinnon's strength was failing with each passing minute, his body's resources depleted by the stress of maintaining readiness for combat. Even if he could fight his way out, the exertion would probably kill him before his enemies managed it. "I'm coming out," McKinnon announced suddenly. "But the woman stays inside until we settle terms." "No terms," Blackwood snarled. "You lost, McKinnon. Accept it." "Did I?" McKinnon's voice carried a note of amusement that sent chills down Isabella's spine. "You boys might want to look behind you before declaring victory." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Isabella to count her own heartbeats. Then she heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching at a gallop. Multiple riders, moving with the disciplined precision of military formations rather than the chaotic charge of angry civilians. "What the hell?" Blackwood's curse was cut short by the unmistakable sound of rifles being cocked. Many rifles, positioned at multiple points around the clearing. "Federal marshals," a voice boomed from the tree line. "You men are surrounded. Drop your weapons and step away from the cabin." Isabella's mind reeled. Federal marshals arriving at exactly the right moment seemed too convenient to be coincidence. Then she remembered the telegram, the official seals, McKinnon's careful preparation of the cabin. This had been planned from the beginning. "McKinnon, you son of a bitch," Sterling breathed, understanding dawning in his voice. "You set us up." "I gave you every chance to walk away," McKinnon replied calmly. "Should have taken it when you had the opportunity." Through her window, Isabella could see muzzle flashes in the forest as the marshals revealed their positions. At least a dozen men, all well-armed and professionally positioned. The 7 conspirators and their corrupt sheriff found themselves caught in a carefully orchestrated trap. Marshal Fletcher, Territorial Authority. The voice from the woods continued. "Sheriff Hartwell, you and your men will surrender your weapons immediately." "This is my jurisdiction." Hartwell protested, but his bluster sounded hollow against the reality of federal authority. "Not anymore," Fletcher replied. "Your jurisdiction ended when you started taking bribes from men who traffic in human beings." The truth hit Isabella like a physical blow. This wasn't just about her rescue from an unwanted marriage. It was about a larger investigation into corruption and human trafficking. McKinnon hadn't been a dying gunfighter looking to perform one last good deed. He had been bait in a federal trap designed to expose systematic criminality. "All of you are under arrest," Fletcher announced. "Conspiracy to violate federal anti-slavery statutes, corruption of public officials, and attempted kidnapping. You have the right to remain silent, though I doubt any of you are smart enough to exercise it." The sound of men dropping weapons echoed through the clearing as the reality of their situation penetrated even the thickest skulls. Isabella watched through her window as federal marshals emerged from concealment, surrounding the would-be kidnappers. With practiced efficiency, McKinnon finally lowered his rifle and leaned heavily against the doorframe. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind the brutal reality of his medical condition. Isabella could see him struggling to remain upright. "You can come out now," he called to her, his voice noticeably weaker than it had been earlier. Isabella emerged from her hiding place to find the cabin surrounded by lawmen in federal uniforms. Marshal Fletcher, a grizzled veteran with silver hair and granite eyes, was directing the arrest and detention of their former tormentors with military precision. "McKinnon," Fletcher acknowledged with a respectful nod. "Good work, though you look like hell." "Feel worse than I look," McKinnon admitted, accepting Isabella's arm for support as his legs threatened to give out. "How long were you watching?" "Long enough to hear everything we needed for prosecution," Fletcher replied. "Your instincts were right. They couldn't resist taking the bait when you made yourself look vulnerable." Isabella stared at McKinnon with new understanding. "You knew they would come. You planned this entire thing." "Not the entire thing," McKinnon corrected, settling heavily into a chair by the fire. "Didn't plan on spending $500. I couldn't afford. But when I heard about the auction, figured it was too good an opportunity to waste." Marshal Fletcher approached them with a folder full of documents. "Miss Crawford, we're going to need your testimony about what happened today. But first, let me explain what you've stumbled into." He spread papers across the table, revealing a web of connections that stretched far beyond Copper Ridge. Bank records, correspondence, witness statements, evidence of a criminal network that had been operating throughout the territory for years. "These 7 men have been running a sophisticated operation," Fletcher explained. "They identify vulnerable women, orphans, widows, immigrants, then manufacture debts or legal complications to force them into situations where they can be sold or traded." Isabella's stomach turned as she realized how close she had come to disappearing forever into their system. "How many others?" "At least 30 that we can document," Fletcher said grimly. "Probably twice that number we'll never be able to prove. Young women who vanished from mining camps, railroad towns, farming communities, all of them fitting the same pattern." McKinnon coughed harshly, the sound wet and painful. When he pulled his handkerchief away, Isabella saw specks of blood on The white fabric. The evening stress had taken a severe toll on his failing body. "How long have you been working on this case?" Isabella asked Fletcher. 2 years, the marshal replied. "Ever since reports started reaching Denver about missing women in remote territories. McKinnon contacted us 6 months ago when his own investigation started uncovering the same patterns." "Your own investigation?" Isabella turned to McKinnon with surprise. "Started looking into it when I heard about a girl from my hometown who disappeared," McKinnon explained quietly. "Lucy Patterson, 16 years old, traveling to meet her fiancé in California. Her train stopped in Copper Ridge for supplies. She was never seen again." The personal motivation explained everything. Why McKinnon had spent his remaining time and money on this operation. Why he had been willing to risk his life despite his terminal condition. He was seeking justice for Lucy Patterson and all the other victims who had vanished into the criminal network. "We've been building the case slowly," Fletcher continued. "Gathering evidence, documenting connections, waiting for the right moment to spring the trap. When McKinnon's doctor gave him his prognosis, he volunteered to serve as bait." Isabella looked at the dying man who had saved her life, understanding now the true scope of his sacrifice. He hadn't just spent his life savings to rescue her. He had spent his remaining life itself, using his terminal condition as a weapon against those who preyed on the vulnerable. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we round up the rest of the network," Fletcher said. "These 7 were just the local operation. We've got evidence pointing to similar groups in at least 6 other territories. This is going to be the biggest human trafficking bust in Western history." Outside, the arrested men were being loaded into wagons for transport to federal court in Denver. Blackwood's curses echoed across the clearing as manacles were locked around his wrists. Sheriff Hartwell sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that his corruption had led him into federal crimes that carried penalties far beyond anything local politics could protect him from. McKinnon stood slowly, moving to the window to watch his enemies being taken away. "Lucy Patterson can rest easy now," he said quietly. "You did good work," Fletcher told him. "Both of you. This operation will save dozens of women from the fate Isabella almost suffered." But Isabella could see that McKinnon's satisfaction was tempered by the knowledge that his time had run out. The confrontation had pushed his failing body beyond its limits, and the blood in his handkerchief was evidence that his condition was deteriorating rapidly. "Daniel," she said softly, using his first name for the first time, "you need to rest." He nodded wearily, the adrenaline finally fading completely and leaving behind the harsh reality of his illness. "Reckon I do. Been a long day." As the federal marshals finished securing the scene and preparing to transport their prisoners, Isabella found herself faced with a new reality. She was free from the immediate threat that had brought her to this point, but her protector was dying and she had nowhere else to go. The rescue was complete, but the real story was just beginning to unfold. Dawn broke over the mountains with the pale promise of a new world, but Daniel McKinnon greeted it from his bed rather than the porch, where he usually watched the sunrise. The previous night's confrontation had extracted a price his failing body could no longer afford to pay. Isabella found him propped against pillows, his breathing shallow and labored. The telegram that had started everything spread across the quilts beside him. "You should have told me," she said softly, settling into the chair she had moved beside his bed during the long night of watching over him. "About Lucy Patterson, about the federal investigation, about what you were really doing." McKinnon's eyes, though dulled by pain and exhaustion, still held their piercing intelligence. Would it have changed anything? "You still needed saving. I still needed to see justice done. Sometimes the reasons matter less than the results." Isabella studied the telegram more closely in the morning light. The details were clearer now. Coordinates for Copper Ridge, descriptions of the 7 conspirators, authorization for McKinnon to act as federal bait in an undercover operation. What struck her most was the date, It had been sent 3 weeks ago, just days after Sister Agnes died and left her vulnerable to Thornfield's machinations. This wasn't a coincidence, she realized. The timing, my situation, everything. They knew about the convent, knew I would be left alone. Federal marshals have been tracking this network for 2 years, McKinnon confirmed, his voice barely above a whisper. They knew Thornfield's patterns, knew he targeted isolated women after family deaths or disasters. When word reached Denver about the epidemic at your convent, Fletcher knew exactly what would follow. The revelation settled over Isabella like a heavy blanket. Her rescue hadn't been random heroism but calculated strategy, her suffering used as bait to catch bigger fish. The knowledge should have angered her, but instead she felt oddly grateful. At least her pain had served a purpose beyond mere victimhood. How many others knew they were being used as bait, she asked. None, McKinnon said simply. Couldn't risk word getting back to the network. The operation only worked if everything appeared genuine, your vulnerability, my intervention, the auction itself. Through the bedroom window, Isabella could see Marshal Fletcher's men breaking camp in the forest, clearing where they had spent the night hidden. Their job was finished, the criminals caught, evidence gathered. Soon they would return to Denver with their prisoners, leaving behind only the memory of justice finally served. What happens to me now? The question had been haunting her since the marshals revealed the true scope of the operation. She was free, but freedom without purpose or destination offered cold comfort. McKinnon reached for her hand with fingers that trembled more each hour. That's up to you. Fletcher says the federal government will provide compensation for your cooperation. Enough to start fresh somewhere. Maybe go back east where life's easier for a woman alone. Isabella considered the possibility of returning to the civilized world beyond the frontier. Cities with proper schools where she could teach, hospitals where her healing knowledge might be useful, churches where she could find the spiritual community the convent had provided. It should have sounded appealing, but somehow it felt like retreat rather than progress. What about you? She asked. Where will you go when this is over? McKinnon's laugh turned into a coughing fit that left flecks of blood on his handkerchief. When he could speak again, his voice held the weary acceptance of a man who had made peace with approaching death. Won't be going anywhere. Figure I'll stay right here until the end comes. This cabin's as good a place as any to close out a life. The matter-of-fact way he discussed his mortality struck Isabella harder than any expression of fear or regret could have. Daniel McKinnon faced death the same way he had faced the 7 criminals, with quiet courage and absolute honesty about the odds against him. A knock at the front door interrupted her thoughts. She rose to answer it, finding Marshal Fletcher standing on the porch with his hat in his hands and concern written across his weathered features. How's he doing? Fletcher asked without preamble. Poorly, Isabella admitted. The stress last night accelerated his decline significantly. I don't think he has much time left. Fletcher nodded grimly. Doctor in town confirmed what Murdoch said about his condition. Cancer too advanced for any treatment, even if we could get him to specialists back east. All we can do now is make him comfortable. Is that why you're here? To discuss his medical care? Partly, Fletcher said, stepping inside when she gestured for him to enter. Also need to talk about what comes next for both of you. The federal government owes you both more than we can ever repay. Isabella led him to the kitchen table where she had been preparing breakfast for McKinnon, though he had shown little appetite for food in recent days. The marshal accepted her offer of coffee and settled into his chair with the careful movements of a man who had spent too many years in the saddle. The compensation package for your cooperation will be substantial. Fletcher began. $5,000, plus travel expenses to anywhere in the United States, plus guarantees of federal protection if any associates of the trafficking network try to retaliate. $5,000 represented wealth beyond Isabella's imagining. With that much money, She could live comfortably for years, perhaps decades if she invested wisely. The sum would buy her complete independence from anyone who might seek to control or exploit her. "And Daniel?" she asked. "Same package," Fletcher said quietly. "Though given his condition, we both know he won't be able to use it. His compensation will go to his estate, such as it is." Isabella felt tears threatening but forced them back. McKinnon's heroism would be rewarded with money he couldn't spend and protection he wouldn't live to need. The injustice of it seemed particularly cruel, given the magnitude of his sacrifice. "There's something else," Fletcher continued. "Something I think you should know about McKinnon's background." He pulled a folder from his saddlebags, spreading documents across the table between them. Isabella recognized some of the papers as official government correspondence, but others looked older, more personal. "Daniel McKinnon isn't just any retired lawman," Fletcher explained. "He's one of the most decorated federal agents in territorial history. Spent 15 years tracking down the worst criminals the frontier could produce: murderers, bank robbers, cattle rustlers, corrupt officials." The documents told a story of exceptional courage and dedication. Commendations from territorial governors, letters of gratitude from victims' families, newspaper clippings describing impossible arrests and dramatic shootouts. McKinnon had been a legend long before illness forced his retirement. "Why are you telling me this?" Isabella asked. "Because you should understand who saved you," Fletcher said simply. McKinnon could have spent his final months in comfortable retirement, taking treatments that might have extended his life by a few weeks or months. Instead, he volunteered for the most dangerous assignment we had available. Isabella studied a photograph from McKinnon's younger days, showing a tall, powerful man in his prime standing beside a group of fellow agents. The contrast with the dying man in the next room was heartbreaking, yet something in his eyes remained unchanged: the quiet determination to see justice done regardless of personal cost. "He requested this assignment specifically," Fletcher continued. "When word reached him about Lucy Patterson's disappearance, he contacted our office and demanded to be part of the investigation. Said he owed it to her family to see their daughter's killers brought to justice." "Did he know Lucy personally?" "She was his godchild," Fletcher revealed. "Her father served under McKinnon during the Indian Wars, died saving McKinnon's life in a skirmish with raiding parties. McKinnon promised to look after his family, helped Lucy's mother raise her after her father's death." The personal connection explained the intensity of McKinnon's commitment to the case. He wasn't just seeking justice for a stranger. He was fulfilling a sacred obligation to a fallen comrade's child. The weight of that responsibility had driven him to spend his final months hunting down her killers, despite his deteriorating health. "The trafficking network killed her," Fletcher said quietly. "We found her body 3 months ago, buried in an unmarked grave outside a mining camp in Colorado. She had been tortured, used, murdered when she became too much trouble to manage." Isabella felt sick at the revelation. The sweet 16-year-old girl, whose disappearance had sparked this entire investigation, had suffered the fate Isabella herself had barely escaped. Without McKinnon's intervention, she would have joined Lucy in an unmarked grave somewhere in the wilderness. "Does Daniel know?" "We told him when we found the body," Fletcher confirmed. "That's when he volunteered for the undercover operation, said he didn't care if it killed him as long as we got the men responsible." The magnitude of McKinnon's sacrifice became clear. He had spent his remaining life not just to save Isabella, but to ensure that Lucy Patterson's killers faced justice, and that no other young women would suffer similar fates. His dying had meaning, purpose, redemption for promises he couldn't keep to a fallen friend. "There's one more thing," Fletcher said, producing a final document from his folder. "McKinnon's will. He updated it last week after meeting you." Isabella's hands trembled as she accepted the legal papers. Most of the language was incomprehensible legal terminology, But certain phrases stood out with startling clarity. To Isabella Crawford, who showed me that salvation can take many forms, and in recognition of her courage and compassion during my final mission. He's leaving you everything, Fletcher explained unnecessarily. This cabin, his personal effects, his horse and wagon, plus whatever money remains from his federal compensation. It's not a fortune, but it's enough to give you options. Isabella stared at the will in disbelief. A man she had known for less than 24 hours was bequeathing her his entire worldly estate. The gesture spoke to something deeper than gratitude. It suggested genuine affection and respect earned in the crucible of shared danger. Why would he do this? Read the personal letter he attached, Fletcher suggested gently. Isabella found the sealed envelope marked with her name in McKinnon's careful handwriting. Inside, his words were brief but powerful. Isabella, you reminded me what it means to fight for something pure in a world gone ugly. Your courage in the face of evil gave me strength during my darkest hours. This cabin was meant to be my tomb, but meeting you made it feel like home again. Use what I leave behind to build something beautiful. Give my sacrifice meaning by living fully. Daniel, tears came then, impossible to hold back any longer. Isabella wept for McKinnon's approaching death, for Lucy Patterson's suffering, for all the victims of the trafficking network, and for herself, a young woman thrust into an adult world of cruelty and corruption, but somehow finding hope in the heroism of a dying stranger. Fletcher waited patiently for her tears to subside before speaking again. He's asking to see you. Says there are things he needs to say while he still can. Isabella dried her eyes and returned to McKinnon's bedroom, finding him more alert than he had been since the confrontation. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to give him temporary strength, though she could see the effort it cost him to maintain consciousness. Fletcher told you about Lucy, he said without preamble. Yes, Isabella confirmed, settling back into her chair beside his bed. I'm sorry. She was lucky to have someone who cared enough to seek justice for her. Should have protected her better, McKinnon said, his voice heavy with regret. Should have warned her about traveling alone. Should have insisted she wait for proper escort. You couldn't have known what would happen. The fault lies with her killers, not with those who loved her. McKinnon's eyes found hers, searching for something he seemed to need to see. Promise me something, Isabella. Promise me you'll use what I'm leaving you to build a life worth living. Don't let what happened to Lucy, what almost happened to you, make you afraid to engage with the world. I promise, she said, meaning it completely. Outside, they could hear Marshal Fletcher's men preparing to depart with their prisoners. Soon the cabin would be quiet again, but this time the silence would hold peace rather than tension. The criminals were caught, justice was being served, and the trafficking network was broken. But for Isabella and Daniel McKinnon, the most important part of their story was just beginning. The part where a dying man found redemption and a young woman discovered strength she never knew she possessed. 3 days after Marshal Fletcher departed with his prisoners, Isabella discovered that death approached like a gentle thief rather than a violent conqueror. McKinnon's decline accelerated with each sunrise, his body surrendering territory it could no longer defend. She had moved a cot into his room, determined that he would not face his final hours alone as Lucy Patterson had in that unmarked grave. The morning brought visitors she hadn't expected. Dr. Henry Westbrook arrived from Denver on the early stage, summoned by Fletcher's urgent telegram. Unlike the corrupt Dr. Murdoch, who had aided the trafficking network, Westbrook radiated competence and genuine compassion. His examination of McKinnon was thorough but gentle, confirming what they already knew while offering what comfort modern medicine could provide. Morphine will ease the pain, Westbrook explained to Isabella as they spoke quietly in the kitchen. But there's nothing that can alter the course of his illness. The cancer has spread too extensively for any intervention to be effective. Isabella accepted the small bottles of medication with hands that had grown steady through necessity. The sisters had taught her to care for the dying, to provide dignity and comfort when healing was no longer possible. She would not fail McKinnon as she had not failed the nuns during the epidemic. "How long?" she asked, though part of her feared the answer. "Days, perhaps a week if he's fortunate," Westbrook said honestly. "His body is remarkable. Most men would have succumbed weeks ago. Whatever's keeping him alive is stronger than physical constitution." Isabella understood. McKinnon was clinging to life until he could be certain his mission was complete, that the trafficking network was truly broken and justice finally served. Purpose had become his medicine, determination his only remaining strength. The second visitor arrived as Westbrook was departing. Catherine Wells stepped down from a hired carriage with the bearing of a woman accustomed to respect and authority. Her black dress and dignified manner suggested recent mourning, but her eyes held steel rather than grief. "You must be Isabella Crawford," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm Catherine Wells. Lucy Patterson was my daughter." The introduction hit Isabella like a physical blow. She had imagined Lucy's mother as a broken woman consumed by grief, not this composed lady who radiated controlled fury and implacable determination. Catherine Wells had come to see justice done with her own eyes. "Mrs. Wells," Isabella managed, accepting the offered handshake, "I'm so sorry for your loss. Your daughter's death is what brought Daniel to seek justice for all of us." "I know," Catherine replied simply. "Marshal Fletcher sent word about the arrests, about Mr. McKinnon's role in destroying the network that killed my child. I came to thank him personally before it's too late." Isabella led her to McKinnon's bedside, where he had managed to prop himself up against the pillows despite his weakness. His eyes brightened when he saw Catherine, recognition and old affection warming his gaunt features. "Kate," he whispered, using what Isabella realized was a childhood nickname. "Didn't expect to see you again on this side of the grave." Catherine's composure finally cracked. Tears she had held back for months spilled down her cheeks as she took his hand in both of hers. "Oh, Danny, look what this world has done to us both." The intimacy of the moment revealed decades of shared history that Isabella could only guess at. These were people who had known each other in happier times, before war and loss and terminal illness had carved away everything soft and hopeful. "Tom would be proud," Catherine continued, referring to her late husband who had died saving McKinnon's life. "You kept your promise to look after us, even when it cost you everything." "Didn't keep it well enough," McKinnon replied, his voice thick with regret. "Lucy should have lived to see grandchildren of her own, not died in some unmarked grave, because I failed to protect her." "You didn't fail," Catherine said firmly. "Evil men killed my daughter, and you made them pay for it. That's more justice than most families ever see." Isabella watched the exchange with a growing understanding of the bonds that connected these people across years of separation and loss. McKinnon's devotion to finding Lucy's killers hadn't been an abstract duty but personal love for a child he had helped raise after her father's death. "There's something else," Catherine said, producing an envelope from her handbag. "Lucy's inheritance from her grandmother back east. $25,000 that was supposed to fund her new life in California." The sum was staggering, representing wealth beyond anything Isabella had imagined. Catherine pressed the envelope into McKinnon's trembling hands with ceremonial solemnity. "She would have wanted this to go to someone who fought for her," Catherine explained. "Someone who risked everything to see her killers brought to justice." McKinnon stared at the envelope as if it contained fire rather than money. "Kate, I can't. This belongs to your family." "My family is dead," Catherine replied with brutal honesty. "Tom died in the war. Lucy died at the hands of monsters. I'm the last Wells left, and I choose to honor my daughter's memory by ensuring her inheritance serves the cause of justice." "Give it to Isabella," McKinnon said suddenly. pushing the envelope toward her with shaking hands. Let Lucy's legacy help another young woman build the life she was denied. Isabella stared at the envelope in shock. Combined with McKinnon's bequest and the federal compensation, she would possess wealth enough to live independently for the rest of her life. The irony wasn't lost on her. Rescued from being sold for $500, she was now being given a fortune that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. "I can't accept this," she protested. "It's too much, too generous. Lucy's money should go to causes she would have supported." "And what cause would that be?" Catherine asked gently. "Justice for women who can't protect themselves. Education for children who have no one else to teach them. Building something good from the ashes of tragedy?" The question struck home because Isabella could indeed envision using such resources for exactly those purposes. The frontier was full of vulnerable people who needed protection, isolated communities that lacked schools or medical care, women trapped in situations similar to what she had barely escaped. "Take it," McKinnon urged, his voice growing weaker with the effort of speaking. "Build something that would make Lucy proud. Create the life she dreamed of having but never got the chance to live." Isabella accepted the envelope with reverence, understanding that she was receiving more than money. She was entrusted with Lucy Patterson's dreams, with the hopes and aspirations of a young woman whose life had been cut short by evil men. The responsibility was both humbling and terrifying. Catherine stayed through the afternoon, sharing stories of Lucy's childhood that painted a picture of a bright, compassionate girl who had dreamed of teaching school in California and raising children of her own. The tales brought warmth to McKinnon's eyes, even as his body continued its inexorable decline. "She used to say she wanted to marry a good man and have 6 children, Catherine recalled with a sad smile. "Said she was going to name the first boy after Uncle Danny, the man who taught her to ride and shoot and stand up for herself." McKinnon's tears came then, the grief he had held back finally overwhelming his iron control. Isabella had never seen a man cry with such devastating sorrow, the sound like something breaking that could never be repaired. "Should have been there," he whispered through his tears. "Should have protected her." "You were protecting dozens of other people," Catherine reminded him firmly. "Lucy wouldn't want you to carry guilt for evil you couldn't prevent. She'd want you to find peace in knowing her death wasn't meaningless." As evening approached, Catherine prepared to return to Denver on the night stage. Her farewell to McKinnon was tender but final. They both understood this would be their last meeting in this world. "Rest easy, Danny," she said, kissing his forehead like the mother she had been to Lucy. "You kept faith with your promises. Tom and Lucy are waiting for you, and they're proud of what you accomplished." After Catherine's departure, the cabin felt smaller and more intimate. Isabella prepared a simple meal that McKinnon barely touched, then read to him from a book of poetry she had found among his possessions. The verses seemed to comfort him, though she suspected it was her voice rather than the words that provided solace. "Isabella," he said during a moment when pain allowed him clarity, "I need you to promise me something else." "Anything," she replied, setting aside the book to give him her full attention. "Don't let what happened to you make you afraid to trust people. The world's got more good folks than bad ones, even if the bad ones make more noise." "I promise," she said, though privately she wondered how she would ever feel safe trusting strangers again. "And don't let being rescued define you," he continued with obvious effort. "You're not a victim who got saved. You're a survivor who fought back. There's a difference." His words carried weight beyond their simple meaning. Isabella realized he was trying to give her the tools she would need to build a meaningful life after his death. Wisdom earned through decades of seeing both the worst and best of human nature. "What should I do with all this money?" she asked. "It feels like too much responsibility for one person." McKinnon's smile was barely visible in the lamplight, but she could hear it in his voice. "Follow your heart. Lucy would have used it to help people, to build something good. Trust yourself to know what that looks like. The night deepened around them, bringing the kind of profound quiet that seemed to magnify every sound, the crackling of the fire, the distant call of an owl, McKinnon's increasingly labored breathing. Isabella dozed fitfully in her chair, starting awake whenever his breathing changed or he stirred restlessly in his sleep. Near dawn, she woke to find him watching her with lucid eyes that seemed to hold all the wisdom and sorrow of his difficult life. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For showing me that some things are worth dying for, and some people are worth saving." His hand found hers across the space between bed and chair. "For giving my death meaning." Isabella squeezed his fingers, gently, feeling the life ebbing from them like water flowing downstream. "Thank you for saving me. For showing me what real courage looks like." "Courage ain't the absence of fear," McKinnon said, his voice barely audible. "It's doing what's right despite being afraid. Remember that." As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Daniel McKinnon closed his eyes for the final time. His death was as quiet and dignified as his life had been loud and heroic. A gentle surrender after a battle fought with honor until the very end. Isabella sat with his body until full daylight, saying prayers the sisters had taught her for the peaceful passage of souls. Then she rose to face a future that was entirely her own, wealthy beyond imagination, free beyond hope, and burdened with the responsibility of making his sacrifice worthwhile. The rescue was complete, but the real work was just beginning. The funeral of Daniel McKinnon drew an unexpected crowd to the small cemetery overlooking Copper Ridge. Isabella had anticipated a modest gathering, perhaps Dr. Westbrook, a few federal marshals, maybe some local residents who respected his reputation. Instead, she found herself standing before dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the man who now lay in a simple pine, coffined beneath the mountain sky. They came from across the territory, former outlaws he had arrested who credited him with setting them on righteous paths, families of victims he had avenged, fellow lawmen who had served alongside him during the dangerous years when civilization was just a distant dream. An elderly Cheyenne chief stood beside a Confederate veteran, united in their respect for a man who had treated all people with equal dignity. Reverend Timothy Morrison, no relation to the imprisoned Dutch Morrison, spoke words of comfort over the grave. His sermon focused on redemption earned through service to others, on lives measured not by their length, but by their impact on the world. Isabella found solace in his message, though her grief felt too large for any words to contain. Daniel McKinnon died as he lived, the Reverend concluded, fighting for those who could not fight for themselves. His legacy lives on in every person he saved, every injustice he corrected, every act of courage he inspired in others. After the service, Marshal Fletcher approached Isabella with documents requiring her signature. The federal compensation had then processed, the legal transfer of McKinnon's property completed. On paper, she was now one of the wealthiest unmarried women in the Colorado Territory. "There's something else," Fletcher said, producing a telegram from his coat. "Message came in this morning from Washington. The president himself has issued a commendation for McKinnon's final operation. They're calling it the most successful anti-trafficking investigation in federal history." Isabella read the official language with growing amazement. The network they had destroyed had tentacles reaching into 6 territories and 2 states. Over 40 suspects were now in federal custody, with more arrests expected as investigations continued. The ripple effects would protect countless women from the fate that had claimed Lucy Patterson. "He would have been proud," she said, carefully folding the telegram with hands that had learned to remain steady through the crisis. "The question now," Fletcher said gently, "is what you plan to do with what he left you. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime. You could live comfortably anywhere in the world." Isabella gazed across the cemetery toward the cabin where she had spent the last week of McKinnon's life. The building looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, surrounded by the garden he had tended during his final months. It would be easy to sell everything and disappear into anonymity, to use her wealth to purchase safety and comfort, far from the dangers of frontier life. But McKinnon's words echoed in her memory. Build something that would make Lucy proud. Create the life she dreamed of having but never got the chance to live. I'm staying, she announced, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. At least for now. There's work to be done here. Fletcher's eyebrows rose. Work? What kind of work? Isabella's mind had been churning with possibilities since Catherine Wells' visit. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was an opportunity to create something meaningful from tragedy. A school. A safe house for women in trouble. Medical clinic for people who can't afford proper care. This territory needs all of those things. That's ambitious, Fletcher said diplomatically. Also dangerous. The men we arrested had friends, business partners who weren't directly involved in the trafficking but profited from it. Some of them might seek revenge. Then I'll hire protection. Isabella replied with steel in her voice that would have made McKinnon proud. Use part of the money to employ guards who understand the difference between right and wrong. Over the following weeks, Isabella threw herself into planning with the focused intensity of someone who had found her life's purpose. She wrote into Copper Ridge daily, meeting with honest businessmen to discuss construction projects, interviewing potential teachers and medical personnel, studying legal documents that would establish her charitable foundations. The town's reaction to her presence was mixed. Some residents viewed her with respect bordering on awe, the woman who had helped bring down the corruption that had poisoned their community. Others regarded her with suspicion or outright hostility, seeing her as an outsider whose wealth gave her inappropriate influence over local affairs. Isabella's first major decision was the purchase of the old Hartwell property on the outskirts of town. The corrupt sheriff's mansion and surrounding land had been seized by federal authorities and put up for auction. She acquired it for a fraction of its value, then announced plans to convert it into a residential school for orphan children. You're making enemies, warned Samuel Hayes, the honest lawyer she had retained to handle her legal affairs. Some folks think you're moving too fast, changing too much too quickly. Good, Isabella replied, reviewing architectural plans for the school's renovation. If I'm not making enemies, I'm probably not challenging the right people. Her second major purchase was the defunct Morrison Mining Company. Acquired after Dutch Morrison's conviction, left his assets in federal receivership. Rather than continuing the dangerous silver extraction that had killed dozens of workers, Isabella announced plans to establish a technical training center where young men could learn safer trades. The transformation of Copper Ridge accelerated through the autumn months. Construction crews worked on multiple projects simultaneously: the school renovation, a new medical clinic, a women's shelter disguised as a boarding house for traveling ladies. Isabella insisted on paying fair wages to all workers, a radical departure from the exploitative practices that had previously characterized local labor relations, but progress attracted opposition from unexpected quarters. Marcus Thornfield, the corrupt auctioneer who had tried to sell her into slavery, had been released on bail pending his federal trial. He used his temporary freedom to organize resistance among the town's remaining criminal elements. She's trying to control everything, Thornfield complained during a meeting at Sterling's abandoned gambling hall. Making herself into some kind of queen who decides how the rest of us should live. The gathering included several dozen men whose livings had depended on the old system of corruption and exploitation. Saloon keepers who had trafficked women, merchants who had cheated customers, politicians who had sold their offices to the highest bidders. All of them saw Isabella's reforms as threats to their way of life. "What do you propose we do about it?" asked Vernon Black, a cattle rustler who had avoided arrest through lack of evidence. Can't exactly auction her off again. Maybe not, Thornfield said with an ugly smile. But accidents happen to people who make too many enemies, especially people who ride alone through isolated country. The threats might have remained mere bluster, but Isabella's next announcement pushed her opponents beyond the bounds of civilized resistance. Standing before the newly established Copper Ridge Town Council, elected in emergency elections after the previous corrupt officials had been arrested, she revealed her most ambitious plan yet. "I'm proposing to establish a territorial women's college," she announced, producing detailed architectural drawings and financial projections. "A fully accredited institution where young ladies can receive education equal to any offered at Eastern universities." The proposal sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. Higher education for women was controversial enough in civilized cities. In a frontier territory, it was revolutionary to the point of radicalism. Even some of Isabella's supporters looked uncertain about such a dramatic step. "Where would you build such an institution?" asked Mayor Henderson, one of the few honest politicians who had survived the corruption purge. "On the old Blackwood Ranch," Isabella replied calmly. "I've purchased the property from federal authorities. The main house will serve as administrative headquarters, with additional buildings constructed for classrooms and dormitories." Jeremiah Blackwood's former cattle empire, seized after his conviction, comprised nearly 10,000 acres of prime land. Converting it into an educational institution would literally transform the landscape of the territory while creating opportunities for hundreds of young women. "The cost must be enormous," observed Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the female physician Isabella had recruited from Denver to run the medical clinic. "Approximately $200,000 for complete construction and the first 5 years of operation," Isabella confirmed. "I'm prepared to fund the entire project through Lucy Patterson's inheritance and my federal compensation." The announcement sparked heated debate that continued for hours. Progressive voices praised Isabella's vision and generosity, while conservative elements questioned both the wisdom and propriety of such radical social change. The discussion grew so contentious that Mayor Henderson was forced to call for order multiple times. But Isabella's most dangerous opposition came from outside the official meeting. In the shadows beyond the town hall, Thornfield and his Confederates listened with growing alarm to proposals that would fundamentally alter the power structure they hoped to restore. "She's got to be stopped," Thornfield declared as the conspirators gathered in an abandoned warehouse after the meeting. "If she builds that college, brings in hundreds of educated women from the back east, we'll never get control of this town again." "What do you suggest?" asked Black, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. "Direct action," Thornfield replied grimly. "Make it clear that some changes won't be tolerated by decent folks." The plot they hatched was simple but potentially effective. Isabella's habit of riding alone to inspect her various construction projects made her vulnerable to ambush. A carefully staged accident could eliminate the source of unwanted reform while making her death appear to be the result of frontier dangers rather than deliberate murder. But Isabella had not survived her ordeal with the trafficking network by being naive about human nature. McKinnon's warnings about making enemies echoed in her memory, and she took practical precautions against the threats she knew were developing. Her first defensive measure was the recruitment of Carlos Mendoza, a former Texas Ranger whose reputation for honesty had made him unemployable in corrupt jurisdictions. Isabella offered him generous wages to serve as her personal bodyguard and security consultant. "You're making smart moves," Mendoza told her during their first meeting. "But smart moves make smart enemies. These men you're challenging won't give up their power without a fight." "Then we'd better be ready for a fight," Isabella replied, demonstrating the marksmanship skills the nuns had taught her for protection against wild animals. Her second precaution was the establishment of a communication network with federal authorities. Marshal Fletcher had left a telegraph code that would summon immediate assistance if Isabella found herself in mortal danger. She also maintained regular correspondence with Catherine Wells, ensuring that someone outside the territory knew about any threats she faced. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 3 weeks after the town council meeting, Isabella was returning from the college construction site when Mendoza spotted dust clouds indicating multiple riders approaching from concealed positions. "Ambush," he said tersely, drawing his rifle. "At least 6 men, probably more. They've got us bracketed between those rock formations." Isabella's heart raced, but her mind remained clear. McKinnon had taught her that panic was more dangerous than bullets, that survival depended on thinking rather than feeling during moments of crisis. "Options?" she asked, checking her own weapon. "Fight our way out or try to parley," Mendoza replied. "Fighting's risky with these odds, but talking might just give them better shots at us." The decision was taken from them when Thornfield's voice echoed across the canyon, amplified by the rock walls into an ominous pronouncement of doom. "Isabella Crawford, you've meddled enough in affairs that don't concern you. Time to face the consequences." "What consequences would those be, Marcus?" Isabella called back, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her throat. "Women who forget their place need reminding," Thornfield replied. "Your place ain't telling men how to run their town." "My place is wherever I choose to make it," Isabella responded with steel in her voice. "Same as any free citizen of these United States." The philosophical debate was interrupted by the crack of rifle fire. Thornfield's men had grown tired of talking and decided to settle the matter with lead. Bullets whined off rocks around Isabella and Mendoza as they scrambled for better cover. "So much for negotiation," Mendoza muttered, returning fire with the practiced accuracy of a professional lawman. The battle that followed was brief but intense. Isabella's marksmanship proved equal to the training the sisters had provided her. Shots forcing attackers to seek cover rather than maintain offensive positions. Mendoza's experience showed in his tactical thinking, using the terrain to create defensive advantages despite being outnumbered. But the real turning point came when the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced the arrival of unexpected allies. A dozen riders topped the ridge behind the ambushers, their badges gleaming in the afternoon sun. Federal marshals, responding to the telegraph message Mendoza had managed to send before the shooting started. "Federal law, drop your weapons." Marshal Fletcher's voice carried the authority of the United States government across the canyon. Thornfield's men found themselves caught between Isabella's defensive position and a superior force of federal agents. Some attempted to surrender immediately, while others tried to fight their way out of the trap. The brief gun battle that followed left 3 of the ambushers dead and the rest in federal custody. "You're getting to be a habit," Fletcher told Isabella as they surveyed the aftermath. "Every time we think we've cleaned up this territory, more corruption crawls out from under rocks. Maybe that's a sign the cleaning needs to be more thorough," Isabella replied, reloading her rifle with hands that betrayed only the slightest tremor. Thornfield's capture and the exposure of his conspiracy had immediate effects throughout Copper Ridge. The remaining criminal elements, seeing federal determination to protect Isabella's reforms, either fled the territory or abandoned their opposition to her projects. Construction on the women's college accelerated, with workers no longer fearing retaliation for their participation. As winter settled over the mountains, Isabella stood on the porch of her cabin watching smoke rise from dozens of chimneys across the valley. The lights of Copper Ridge twinkled in the growing darkness, representing families who now lived without fear of corruption or exploitation. The School for Orphan Children had opened its doors in October, welcoming 30 students from across the territory. The medical clinic was treating patients who had previously gone without care, while the women's shelter had already provided safety for a dozen women fleeing dangerous situations. Most importantly, construction of the Territorial Women's College was proceeding ahead of schedule. The main building would be ready for occupancy by spring, with the first class of students expected to arrive in September. Isabella had already received applications from young women as far away as California and Texas, drawn by the promise of educational opportunities unavailable anywhere else in the Western Territories. "Daniel would be proud," she said aloud to the mountain wind, speaking to the memory of the man whose sacrifice had made everything possible. In her pocket, she carried the last letter Catherine Wells had sent, bearing news that Lucy Patterson's grave had been moved to a proper cemetery with a headstone reading, "Beloved daughter whose death sparked a revolution of justice." The inscription seemed fitting for a young woman whose murder had ultimately led to the salvation of countless others. But Isabella's greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that she had honored McKinnon's final request. She had built something meaningful from tragedy, created opportunity from loss, transformed a place of corruption into a beacon of hope for the entire territory. The rescue had been completed, the criminals punished, the victims honored. Now the real work could begin, the long, patient process of building a better world, one student, one patient, one rescued woman at a time. Spring returned to the Colorado Territory with a promise that seemed almost too good to believe. Isabella Crawford stood at the newly installed windows of Patterson Hall, the main building of the Territorial Women's College, named in honor of Lucy's memory, watching the first class of students arrive for their inaugural semester. 23 young women from across the frontier had traveled hundreds of miles to seize an educational opportunity that would have been unimaginable just 18 months earlier. The transformation of the former Blackwood Ranch into an academic institution was nothing short of miraculous. Where cattle had once grazed under the shadow of tyranny, lecture halls now welcomed the brightest female minds the territory could offer. The dormitories buzzed with excitement as students from farming communities, mining towns, and railroad settlements discovered peers who shared their hunger for knowledge and advancement. Miss Crawford, called Margaret Saunders, the college's first dean and a graduate of Vassar College who had abandoned Eastern comfort for frontier opportunity. "The territorial governor has arrived for the dedication ceremony." Governor William Harrison represented the new generation of political leadership that had emerged following the corruption purge. Unlike his predecessor, who had been purchased by men like Blackwood and Sterling, Harrison had campaigned on promises of honest government and social progress. His presence at the college opening signaled official support for Isabella's educational revolution. "Governor Harrison," Isabella greeted him formally, though privately she marveled at how naturally she had adapted to playing hostess to territorial dignitaries. "Thank you for honoring us with your presence." "The honor is mine, Miss Crawford," Harrison replied, his eyes taking in the impressive facilities that had risen from what was once a criminal's empire. "What you've accomplished here will benefit the entire territory for generations to come." The dedication ceremony drew an audience of over 200 people, including territorial legislators, federal officials, prominent businessmen, and families of the incoming students. Isabella's opening remarks focused not on her own achievements, but on the memory of those who had made the college possible. "This institution exists because of 3 people who paid the ultimate price for justice," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Lucy Patterson, whose murder exposed the criminal network that had poisoned our territory. Daniel McKinnon, who sacrificed his life to see that network destroyed. And all the unnamed victims whose suffering went unrecorded but not unremembered." In the front row, Catherine Wells wiped away tears of pride and sorrow. She had moved to Copper Ridge permanently, accepting Isabella's invitation to serve as the college's director of student welfare. Her presence ensured that Lucy's spirit would guide the institution created in her memory. "Education," Isabella continued, "is the greatest weapon against ignorance, hatred, and exploitation. Every young woman who graduates from this college will carry that weapon into a world that desperately needs the light of knowledge and compassion. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a bronze statue in the college's main courtyard. The sculptor had captured Daniel McKinnon as he had appeared in his prime, tall, strong, and determined, with eyes that seemed to watch over all who passed beneath his gaze. The inscription reads simply, "He died so others might live free." But the real measure of success came in the weeks that followed, as the college settled into its academic routine. Isabella made daily rounds through the classrooms, observing lessons in mathematics, literature, natural sciences, and practical skills like bookkeeping and nursing. The quality of instruction rivaled anything available in Eastern universities. Thanks to the generous salaries that attracted qualified professors to the frontier, perhaps more importantly, the college had already begun producing graduates who would transform their communities. 3 students from the preparatory program had been accepted to medical schools back east, while others were returning to their hometowns as qualified teachers. The ripple effects of education were spreading throughout the territory like rings. In a still pond, Isabella's other institutions were flourishing as well. The orphan school had expanded twice to accommodate demand, now housing and educating over 60 children who might otherwise have faced lives of poverty and ignorance. The medical clinic treated hundreds of patients monthly, with Dr. Sarah Mitchell earning recognition as one of the territory's most skilled physicians. The women's shelter, though deliberately kept discreet to protect its residents, had provided sanctuary for dozens of women fleeing abusive situations. Many had moved on to establish new lives elsewhere, but others had remained in Copper Ridge to work at Isabella's various enterprises. Former victims had become advocates, using their experiences to help other women escape similar fates. The transformation of Copper Ridge itself was equally dramatic. Where corruption had once festered, honest businesses now thrived. The town's population had nearly doubled as word spread about opportunities for legitimate employment and fair treatment. Churches, schools, and civic organizations had replaced gambling dens and houses of ill repute. But Isabella's greatest personal satisfaction came from an unexpected source, a letter from the territorial capital, announcing her appointment to the newly created Commission on Territorial Development. Governor Harrison had nominated her based on her demonstrated ability to create positive change, making her the first woman to hold such a position in Colorado Territory. The commission will advise on matters affecting the territory's social and economic development, Harrison explained during her formal swearing-in ceremony. Your experience building institutions from nothing makes you uniquely qualified for this responsibility. The appointment represented more than personal recognition. It symbolized how far the territory had come toward accepting women as equal participants in public life. Isabella's success had opened doors that might have remained closed for decades. Without her example, yet even as she celebrated these achievements, Isabella remained haunted by memories of how close she had come to a very different fate. Sometimes, particularly during quiet evenings at the cabin she still called home, she would imagine what her life might have been if Daniel McKinnon had not intervened that terrible day at the auction block. The nightmares had never completely disappeared. She would dream of Blackwood's scarred hands reaching for her, or Morrison's pale eyes studying her like prey, or Dr. Murdoch's clinical detachment as he discussed her potential uses. But these dark visions were increasingly balanced by dreams of Lucy Patterson smiling in approval of the college, built in her memory, or McKinnon nodding with satisfaction at justice finally served. One evening in late spring, as Isabella reviewed architectural plans for a new wing of the medical clinic, Carlos Mendoza knocked on her door with news that changed everything she thought she knew about her story. "Miss Isabella," he said, his weathered face grave with concern, "got a telegram from Marshal Fletcher in Denver. There's something you need to know about the trafficking network." Isabella set aside her papers, her attention immediately focused on Mendoza's troubled expression. "What kind of something?" "They found records in Murdoch's basement," Mendoza explained. producing the telegram Fletcher had sent. Documents showing the network was bigger than anyone suspected. They weren't just operating in the territories, they had connections reaching all the way to Washington. The revelation struck Isabella like a physical blow. She had believed. The network destroyed, its leaders captured and punished. The possibility that larger forces remained active filled her with the familiar chill of vulnerability. "How much bigger?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Federal investigators are still piecing it together," Mendoza replied. "But it looks like there were operations in at least 12 states and territories. Politicians, judges, business leaders, people with enough power to protect the network from federal investigation." Isabella studied the telegram, noting Fletcher's carefully coded language that suggested ongoing operations too sensitive for open communication. The implications were staggering. The criminal conspiracy that had nearly consumed her was merely one tentacle of a much larger monster. "There's more," Mendoza continued reluctantly. "Fletcher thinks some of the network's leaders might try to eliminate you as a witness. You're the only survivor who can testify about their methods, the only person who saw their operation from the inside." The threat was both familiar and terrifying. Isabella had survived one attempt on her life, but enemies with federal connections would have resources and reach far beyond anything Thornfield's local conspirators could muster. "What does Fletcher recommend?" she asked. "Relocation to a safe house back east until the investigation is complete," Mendoza said. "Federal protection, new identity if necessary. They'd take care of you, but you'd have to abandon everything you've built here." Isabella looked around the cabin where she had nursed McKinnon through his final days, where she had planned the institutions that now served hundreds of people throughout the territory. Leaving would mean abandoning, not just her work but her identity as the woman who had transformed tragedy into triumph. "No," she said firmly, "I won't run from these people again. I won't let them take away what Daniel and Lucy died to protect." Mendoza had expected this response, but his expression remained troubled. "Then we need to prepare for war. These aren't local criminals we're dealing with anymore. They're professional killers with unlimited resources." Over the following weeks, Isabella's world transformed once again, but this time in preparation for battle rather than construction. Mendoza recruited additional security personnel, all veterans of frontier conflicts who understood the stakes involved. The college received discreet protective measures disguised as routine maintenance, while the women's shelter was quietly relocated to a more defensible position. Federal marshals arrived in Copper Ridge under cover of routine patrol duties, but Isabella knew they were positioning assets for her protection. The careful network of early warning systems and emergency communication that Fletcher established reminded her uncomfortably of military preparations for siege warfare. The attack, when it finally came, was more sophisticated than anything Thornfield had attempted. Professional assassins approached through multiple vectors, using darkness and weather to mask their movements. Only Mendoza's vigilance and the federal marshal's quick response prevented what could have been a massacre. The gunfight that erupted around Isabella's cabin lasted nearly an hour, with attackers employing military tactics and equipment that confirmed the network's high-level connections. But the defenders held their ground, and when dawn broke over the blood-stained clearing, 6 professional killers lay dead while their intended target remained unharmed. "This ends now," Fletcher announced when he arrived with reinforcements. "We're taking down the entire network, starting from the top and working our way down. No more half measures." The federal investigation that followed was the largest criminal conspiracy prosecution in American history. Over 200 arrests were made across 12 states and territories, including sitting congressmen, federal judges, and business leaders whose wealth had purchased immunity from previous investigations. Isabella's testimony before a special federal commission in Washington became front-page news across the nation. Her clear, compelling account of the network's operations and the courage of those who had fought to destroy it galvanized public opinion in favor of comprehensive law enforcement reform. "The men who tried to buy and sell me like livestock," she told the packed hearing room, represented something more evil than individual corruption. They embodied a system that treats human beings as property, that profits from suffering, that corrupts every institution it touches. The Commission's final report led to new federal legislation strengthening anti-trafficking laws and establishing permanent task forces to combat organized crime. Isabella's ordeal had contributed to legal changes that would protect future generations from similar exploitation. But her greatest satisfaction came from returning to Copper Ridge and resuming the work that had given her life meaning. The college was thriving, with applications now coming from young women across the country who had heard about the educational opportunities available on the frontier. The medical clinic had expanded into a full hospital, while the orphan school had become a model program studied by educators throughout the nation. Standing in the college courtyard 5 years after that terrible day at the auction block, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She was now 26 years old, wealthy beyond measure, respected throughout the territory, and surrounded by institutions she had created to honor the memory of those who had died for justice. "You would be proud," she said quietly to McKinnon's statue, a daily ritual that had become as natural as breathing. "We built something worthy of your sacrifice." A gentle hand touched her shoulder. Isabella turned to find Catherine Wells, now the college's beloved director of student welfare, smiling with the mixture of sorrow and joy that had become their shared expression when remembering the dead. "They're both proud," Catherine said, referring to both McKinnon and Lucy. "Somewhere beyond this world, they're watching and smiling at what grew from the seeds of their sacrifice." As the evening shadows lengthened across the courtyard, students hurried to their dormitories with arms full of books and minds, full of knowledge that would transform not just their own lives, but the communities they would serve. The lights of Copper Ridge twinkled in the valley below, representing hundreds of families who lived in safety and prosperity. Because evil men had been brought to justice, Isabella Crawford had been rescued from slavery by a dying gunfighter's courage. But she had rescued herself through the choices she made afterward. The victim had become a victor, the rescued had become a rescuer, and the powerless young woman who had stood trembling on an auction block had become a force for justice that would echo through generations. The story that began with 7 men bidding on human flesh had become a tale of institutions built to protect and educate. The nightmare that started with corruption and cruelty had transformed into a dream of opportunity and hope. And in the bronze eyes of Daniel McKinnon's statue, the dying gunfighter's legacy lived on, watching over all who passed beneath his gaze, protecting those who could not protect themselves, and standing as eternal testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest victories come from the smallest acts of courage in the darkest moments of despair. The virgin girl who had nearly been given to 7 men had instead given herself to a cause greater than any individual life. And in that giving, she had found not just salvation but purpose, not just rescue but redemption, not just survival but the strength to ensure that no one else would suffer as she had suffered. The auction block in Copper Ridge had been torn down years ago, replaced by a fountain dedicated to the memory of trafficking victims. But the statue of the dying cowboy remained, hand forever resting on his gun, eyes forever watching for those who might prey on the innocent. And beneath his bronze protection, the work continued, one student, one patient, one rescued soul at a time. The years that followed brought challenges Isabella could never have imagined during those first desperate months after McKinnon's death. The Territorial Women's College became a lightning rod for controversy as conservative politicians from back east denounced it as a dangerous experiment in social engineering. Letters arrived weekly from congressmen and senators demanding federal investigation into what they termed radical feminist indoctrination of impressionable young women. Isabella responded to each attack with the same measured dignity McKinnon had shown in the face of corruption. She invited critics to visit the college, to observe classes firsthand, to speak with students whose academic achievements rivaled those of any male institution. Gradually, even the most skeptical visitors found their objections crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. The breakthrough came when President Ulysses Grant himself visited Colorado Territory during a Western tour. Isabella had requested a meeting through Marshall Fletcher's federal connections, hoping to secure presidential support for educational expansion. What she received exceeded her wildest expectations. "Miss Crawford," Grant said during their private meeting in the governor's mansion, "I've read the reports about your work here. What you've accomplished represents the finest ideals of American opportunity and justice." The presidential endorsement transformed public perception overnight. Newspapers across the nation published editorials praising the Colorado experiment, while philanthropists from eastern cities began offering financial support for similar institutions in other territories. But Isabella's most profound satisfaction came from individual success stories that validated every sacrifice made along the way. Maria Santos, one of the college's first graduates, returned to her native New Mexico territory to establish schools for Hispanic children, whose education had been neglected by territorial authorities. Rebecca Thompson became the first female doctor licensed to practice in Wyoming Territory, while Susan Parker founded a newspaper that exposed corruption in Montana's territorial government. Each graduate carried forward the mission of justice and education that had cost McKinnon his life and given Isabella her purpose. The ripple effects spread across the frontier like wildfire, igniting movements for social reform that would reshape the American West for generations to come. Isabella's personal life evolved as well, though romance remained elusive despite numerous suitors drawn by her wealth and reputation. She had learned to trust carefully after her ordeal, and few men proved capable of seeing past her public persona to the vulnerable woman beneath. The exception was Professor Jonathan Harding, a widowed historian who arrived from Harvard University to document the college's pioneering educational methods. Unlike other men who approached Isabella with transparent calculations about her fortune, Harding seemed genuinely interested in her ideas and accomplishments. "You've created something unprecedented," he told her during one of their long conversations about educational philosophy. "Not just a college, but a model for what American society could become if we had the courage to embrace true equality." Their courtship was conducted through intellectual discourse rather than romantic gestures, building a foundation of mutual respect that gradually blossomed into deeper affection. When Harding proposed marriage during the college's 5th anniversary celebration, Isabella's acceptance surprised no one who had observed their partnership developing over months of collaboration. Their wedding in the college chapel was attended by over 400 guests, including territorial officials, federal marshals, former students, and rescued women whose lives had been transformed by Isabella's institutions. Catherine Wells served as matron of honor, while Governor Harrison performed the ceremony that united two remarkable educators in both love and common purpose. "Today we witness not just the marriage of two individuals," Harrison proclaimed, "but the joining of two minds dedicated to advancing human knowledge and dignity on the American frontier." Isabella's honeymoon was characteristically unconventional, a tour of Eastern universities where she and Jonathan studied innovative teaching methods that could be adapted for frontier conditions. They returned to Colorado with plans for expanding the college's curriculum to include advanced studies in law, medicine, and engineering. The expansion required Isabella to make difficult decisions about resource allocation. Her wealth, though substantial, was not infinite, and the growing demands of multiple institutions strained even her generous budget. She chose to establish an endowment fund, investing carefully to ensure her projects would survive long after her own death. Investment strategy proved prescient when a financial panic in 1873 bankrupted numerous Western enterprises. Isabella's diversified portfolio and conservative management allowed her institutions not only to survive but to expand their services to families devastated by economic collapse. During the crisis, the college opened its doors to daughters of bankrupt miners and failed ranchers, providing education they could no longer afford. The medical clinic treated patients regardless of their ability to pay, while the women's shelter housed wives and daughters left destitute by their families. Financial ruin. This is exactly what Daniel would have wanted, Catherine Wells observed as they watched volunteers distribute food to hungry families. Using prosperity to help others survive adversity. The observation prompted Isabella to establish the McKinnon Foundation, a permanent charitable organization dedicated to continuing his legacy of protecting the vulnerable. The foundation's mission statement, carved in granite above its headquarters, read, "He died so others might live free. May his example inspire endless generations to choose courage over comfort." As the frontier gradually transformed into settled territory, Isabella found herself adapting to new challenges that required different skills than those needed for her original rescue missions. Statehood for Colorado brought political complexities that demanded diplomatic finesse rather than direct confrontation. With criminals. Her appointment to the State Constitutional Convention in 1876 marked another historic first, the only woman delegate charged with crafting Colorado's fundamental law. Isabella used her position to advocate for constitutional guarantees of educational opportunity and legal protection for victims of trafficking and domestic violence. "We have the chance to create something truly revolutionary," she argued before the assembled delegates. "A state constitution that recognizes the full humanity and equal rights of all citizens, regardless of gender or social origin." The final document included stronger anti-trafficking provisions than any other state constitution, along with explicit guarantees of educational access that would serve as models for future Western states. Isabella's influence helped establish legal foundations that would protect vulnerable populations for decades to come. But perhaps her greatest triumph was entirely personal: the birth of her daughter, Lucy Catherine Harding, in 1877, named for both Lucy Patterson and Catherine Wells. The child represented hope for a future generation that would take equality and opportunity as natural rights, rather than revolutionary concepts. Holding her newborn daughter in the same cabin where she had nursed McKinnon through his final days, Isabella reflected on the miraculous journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. The terrified young woman who had stood trembling on an auction block had become a mother, educator, and force for social change whose influence extended across the nation. "Your legacy lives on," she whispered to McKinnon's memory, imagining his spirit watching over the child who would grow up in the world he had died to create. As night fell over the Colorado mountains, Isabella stood on her porch holding her sleeping daughter while stars emerged in the vast western sky. Somewhere among those distant lights, she believed, the souls of Daniel McKinnon and Lucy Patterson continued their eternal watch over those who fought for justice in an imperfect world. The auction block was gone, replaced by a fountain. The trafficking network was destroyed, its leaders imprisoned or dead. The corrupt officials had been swept from office, replaced by honest servants of the people. And in their place stood institutions dedicated to education, healing, and protection, monuments to the truth that individual courage, however costly, could transform entire societies. The virgin girl who had nearly been given to 7 men had instead given herself to a cause that would outlive empires. And in that choice, she had found not just personal redemption, but the key to redeeming a whole corner of the American frontier from the darkness that had once consumed it. The dying cowboy's last gunfight had ended in victory more complete than any bullet could achieve. and his legacy would endure as long as brave souls chose to stand against injustice, no matter the personal cost. In the end, that was all any hero could ask for, that their sacrifice would inspire others to carry on the fight for a world worth dying to protect. The decade of the 1880s brought unprecedented growth to Isabella's educational empire as railroad expansion connected Colorado to major eastern cities. Students now arrived from as far away as Boston and Charleston, drawn by the college's reputation for academic excellence and progressive values. The dormitories, originally built for 50 residents, housed nearly 300 young women by 1885, but growth brought complications Isabella had never anticipated. Wealthy Eastern families began attempting to purchase preferential treatment for their daughters, offering massive donations in exchange for guaranteed admission and special privileges. Isabella rejected every such overture, maintaining strict, merit-based selection despite the financial temptations. Excellence cannot be bought, she declared during a heated board meeting where several trustees argued for accepting a railroad baron's $100,000 offer. The moment we compromise our principles for money, we betray everything Daniel McCaden died to protect. Her refusal to accommodate privilege earned enemies among America's industrial elite, but it also attracted the attention of progressive reformers who saw the college as a beacon of democratic ideals. Jane Addams visited from Chicago, praising Isabella's integration of practical training with classical education. Susan B. Anthony delivered a stirring commencement address about women's suffrage, while Frances Willard recruited graduates for the temperance movement. The college's influence extended far beyond its physical boundaries as graduates established schools, hospitals, and reform organizations throughout the expanding nation. Isabella maintained correspondence with hundreds of former students, creating an informal network of educated women who shared intelligence about social conditions and political opportunities across the frontier. One particularly troubling letter arrived from former student Elizabeth Morrison, now teaching in a mining camp in Montana Territory. Morrison reported suspicious disappearances of young women that echoed the patterns Isabella remembered from the trafficking network supposedly destroyed years earlier. "The methods are more sophisticated now," Morrison wrote, "but the results are identical. Women vanish without explanation, always those without powerful family connections to demand investigation." Isabella shared the letter with Marshall Fletcher, now promoted to Chief of Territorial Investigations. His response confirmed her darkest suspicions. Remnants of the trafficking network had regrouped under new leadership, adapting their methods to avoid federal detection while continuing their exploitation of vulnerable women. "We thought we cut off the head," Fletcher admitted during a secret meeting at the college. "Turns out we only trimmed some branches. The roots go deeper than we imagined." The revelation that her greatest triumph might have been incomplete devastated Isabella more than any personal attack could have. She had built her entire adult identity around the belief that McKinnon's sacrifice had permanently ended the evil they had fought together. Learning that similar crimes continued elsewhere felt like betrayal of his memory. But grief transformed into determination as Isabella realized she possessed resources and influence her younger self could never have imagined. The college's network of graduates could serve as intelligence gatherers, reporting suspicious activities across the frontier. Her wealth could fund investigations beyond federal jurisdiction, while her political connections could pressure authorities to take action. "We're going back to war," she announced to Jonathan and Catherine during a late-night strategy session. "But this time we fight with information instead of guns, with institutions instead of individual heroism." The campaign Isabella launched was unlike anything attempted in American law enforcement history. Using the college's alumni network as correspondents, she created a continent-spanning intelligence system that tracked missing women, suspicious business practices, and corrupt officials who might be protecting criminal operations. Graduate Margaret O'Sullivan, now practicing law in San Francisco, discovered financial connections between legitimate businesses and suspected trafficking operations. Former student Dr. Patricia Williams, working in a New Orleans hospital, documented suspicious injuries among women brought for treatment by well-dressed men who refused to provide names or addresses. Each piece of evidence was carefully cataloged and shared with federal authorities, building cases that traditional law enforcement methods could never have developed. Isabella's systematic approach, combining academic rigor with investigative journalism, revolutionized how organized crime was understood and combated. The breakthrough came when graduate reporter Sarah Kennedy exposed a trafficking ring operating from Chicago's most fashionable districts. Kennedy's investigation, funded by Isabella's foundation and protected by federal marshals, revealed connections to politicians, judges, and business leaders throughout the Midwest. The resulting trials, covered extensively by newspapers nationwide, finally completed the work McKinnon had begun. Over 300 arrests were made in coordinated raids across 12 states, dismantling what prosecutors called the largest criminal conspiracy in American history. Isabella testified before Congress during hearings that led to the creation of a permanent federal anti-trafficking bureau. Her recommendations for victim protection and rehabilitation services became national policy, while her educational approaches were adopted by law enforcement agencies throughout the country. Today we honor not just the courage of those who fought this evil, she told the packed congressional hearing room, but the memory of Daniel McKinnon, whose dying breath gave birth to a movement that spans our entire nation. The congressional testimony marked the peak of Isabella's public influence, but her most meaningful achievements remained centered on education and individual transformation. By 1890, the college had graduated over 800 women, while the associated schools and medical facilities had served tens of thousands throughout the Western territories. Isabella's own family grew as well, with the births of sons Daniel and Thomas, named for McKinnon and Jonathan's late father respectively. Watching her children play in the same gardens where she had once mourned, McKinnon's death filled Isabella with profound gratitude for the unexpected directions life could take. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you had never drawn that gun," she said during one of her daily visits to McKinnon's statue, baby Thomas sleeping peacefully in her arms. "But then I remember you didn't save just me that day. You saved everyone who came after." The approaching 20th century brought new challenges as Isabella entered her 50s, with her life's work largely complete. Younger reformers advocated for women's suffrage and labor rights with energy that reminded her of her own revolutionary days. She chose to support rather than compete with their efforts, using her wealth and influence to fund their campaigns. Her greatest pride came from watching her own children embrace the values of service and justice she had learned from McKinnon's example. Young Lucy Catherine, now 13, announced her intention to become a doctor like Dr. Williams, while Daniel Jr. showed remarkable aptitude for the legal studies that might help him protect the vulnerable. "You're raising another generation of fighters," Catherine Wells observed as they watched the children studying together in the college library. "Daniel's legacy will live on through them as well." The observation proved prophetic when 16-year-old Lucy Catherine organized her fellow students to protest the exclusion of immigrant children from territorial schools. Her passionate speech to the school board, delivered in fluent Spanish learned from the college's Hispanic students, forced policy changes that opened educational opportunities to hundreds of previously excluded children. "The sins of one generation need not be visited upon the next," Lucy Catherine declared with her mother's fierce determination. "Every child deserves the chance to build a better future through education." Watching her daughter carry forward the mission of justice and equality, Isabella finally understood the full meaning of McKinnon's sacrifice. He had not died simply to save one young woman from a terrible fate. He had died to plant seeds of transformation that would grow and multiply across generations, creating a better world one student, one graduate, one protected child at a time. As the 19th century drew to a close, Isabella stood once more in the college courtyard, where McKinnon's statue watched over the continuing work of justice and education. Around her, students from every corner of America pursued knowledge that would carry them to positions of influence and authority throughout the emerging modern world. The auction block was a distant memory, replaced by institutions that would endure long after everyone who remembered that terrible day had passed into history. The dying cowboy's last stand had become an eternal victory, protecting not just one vulnerable woman, but countless generations of those who would follow in her footsteps, and in the bronze eyes that never closed, never faltered, never stopped watching over those in need of protection. Daniel McKinnon's vigil continued, guardian angel of the frontier, patron saint of second chances, eternal reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can change the entire world. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.